In this video, we're going to talk about price regulations. So these are going to be specifically price controls that are in the category of being a price ceiling or a price floor. Often we get these types of regulations because politicians and interest groups call for the control of prices on certain goods and services. So in this video, we're going to look at several examples of this. But first we need to define specifically our regulations. So a price ceiling is going to be a regulation that sets the highest price that can be legally paid for a good or service, while a price floor sets a regulation that the price floor is a regulation that sets the price minimum price that can be legally paid for a good or service. So consider our picture of a house on this slide. Right, and think about what the function of a ceiling is, right? It keeps not only things out, but it keeps things in the house as well. So if I was standing inside of a home and had a helium balloon in my hand and let it go, the ceiling is going to stop the balloon's rise in the air before its natural stopping point, right? That balloon's natural stopping point is up in the atmosphere where the air pressure is the same as that inside the balloon. Right? So that ceiling on the home artificially stops the rising of the balloon. So just like that, price ceilings, when they're effective, and that's an important caveat, when they're effective, will stop prices from rising to where they naturally would want to go. Okay? Price floors, in contrast, are going to operate similar to the floor of a home, especially if you're on a second level, right? If you're on the second level of a building, that floor is keeping you from where you're naturally going to go, right? If we were to snap our fingers and the floor disappears, you're going to fall to the ground below, right? Because gravity is pulling you down back towards the earth. So the price floor is stopping your descent from its above its natural stopping place. And so that's what price floors are similarly going to do for prices when they're effective. And again, that when it's effective is an important caveat. A price floor, when it's effective, stops the price from descending to its natural stopping point, which is, of course, equilibrium. So we're going to focus on price ceilings first. So again, these are regulations that set the highest price that can be paid legally for a good or service. And they're only going to be binding, they're only going to be effective when they're set below the equilibrium price. So if a price ceiling is set above the equilibrium price, it will be what we call non-binding. So here we have on our graph the market for pizza with a price floor imposed. So that price floor is set at a price of $8, right? So this is, sorry, not price floor, this is a price ceiling. A price ceiling imposed. And again, this price ceiling is set at $8. And we know it's effective because that $8 price is below the market price of $10, that market clearing price or market equilibrium price. So what happens in our market when that price is set below the equilibrium is now producers want to provide much less pizza than they did before, and consumers want to consume more than they did before, right? So we can see that price moves along the supply curve, right? To that $8 price gets us 6 slices of pizza, or excuse me, 6 pizzas, whereas that $10 price gave us 10 pizzas on the supply side. And on our demand side, again, as we move along the demand curve to our new $8 price, quantity demanded goes up to 12 from 10. And so what that creates for us is what the book calls excess demand, or you might know as a shortage. Okay, those are the same concepts. Okay. When we have this shortage, one, the market is not clearing, right? So that's telling us quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, and so there is no clearing of our market, right? That's going to affect the distribution of surplus. So when the price is at equilibrium, consumer surplus is A, B, and C. You can see that detailed here at the top of the slide. And producer surplus is D, E, F. Right? Again, you can see that detailed here. After the price ceiling is imposed, now fewer pizzas are traded, right? Previously 10 were bought and sold. Now only 6 can be, because that's all that producers are making. So that means that both consumer surplus and producer surplus change, right? So consumer surplus goes to A, B, and D, right? They lose the area C, but they gain D from producers because of the lower price. And producers lose DE and only get F, all right? C and E, no one earns. It's called deadweight loss, right? So what deadweight loss refers to is the gains that are not gotten by anyone because exchanges don't occur. So they're the losses from foregone trades is another way to say that. Right. Hopefully you remember from principles, trade is what creates wealth for us, right? It's what moves goods from less valued uses to more valued uses. Okay, so when those trades can't occur, there's some surplus that's lost in the market, and this is what we call deadweight loss. The next few slides are going to walk through what we just talked about. So the price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price. This results in a lower price for both consumers and producers. Consumers increase their quantity demanded from 10,000 pizzas to 12,000. Quantity supplied decreases from 10,000 pizzas to 6,000. And when we have quantity demanded exceeding quantity supplied, that gives us an excess demand in the market or a shortage. As a result of that excess demand, right, we have trades that can't happen. People cannot buy and sell as many pizzas as they'd otherwise like to, which means we have deadweight loss. And again, deadweight loss is the result of those foregone trades. Another way of saying that is the reduction in total surplus that occurs as a result of this market inefficiency. And so the surplus, and meaning the like consumer and producer surplus lost in the market, is equal to the areas C plus E on that previous graph. As a result of the lower price, like we discussed, there also is some transfer of consumer surplus to, of producer surplus to consumer surplus. And so consumer surplus changes from ABC to ABD, and producer surplus goes from DEF to just F. So what we're going to see in our real world is that consumer groups are often going to be the ones lobbying for price ceilings because they transfer that surplus from producers to consumers. It's consumers who want apartment regulation in terms of pricing, so rent control. It's consumers who cry out against perceived price gouging, right? So if you ever see a price ceiling being suggested, it's going to be a consumer group pushing for that regulation. How elastic supply and demand is will determine how large of a deadweight loss occurs as a result of a price ceiling, as well as how large the transfer is. So if both supply and demand are relatively elastic, we're going to see a large deadweight loss, but the transfer between producers to consumers is going to be smaller. And that's because we have both groups of producers and consumers being more sensitive to price changes, meaning that they're going to adjust how much they demand and supply much more to the price change. So you can see that here. We have supply and demand both being fairly elastic. We have this huge fall in quantity of pizzas traded as a result of the $2 price drop, right, from 10,000 to 4,000. So deadweight loss is quite large. Whereas that transfer from producers to consumers is smaller. If instead we have demand and supply being relatively inelastic, right, meaning that consumers and producers are less sensitive to those price changes, then deadweight loss is going to be smaller, but the transfer will be larger. So here you can see supply. This is our supply curve here. Its notation is in the wrong spot for some reason. You're going to see we have both supply and demand being relatively inelastic. Deadweight loss in this case is much smaller, with the $2 fall in price for pizzas because of the price ceiling. There's a much smaller reduction in the quantity of pizzas sold from 10,000 to 8,000 now. And the transfer of surplus from producers to consumers is much larger. Right? And so there you can see them compared. Deadweight loss with elastic curves is much larger than deadweight loss with inelastic curves. Transfer with elastic curves is much smaller than transfer with inelastic curves. All right. Now let's go on to the price floor. So a price floor is a regulation that sets, in this case, the minimum price that can be legally paid. It's going to only be binding when set above the equilibrium price, right? Because it's trying to keep the price from going to the lower point that it naturally will. And so if it's set below the equilibrium price, it's going to be a non-binding price floor. So here you can see a price floor set on peanuts. The equilibrium price is $500. The price floor is set at $1,000 above, so above that equilibrium price, so it will be effective. At the equilibrium price of 500, 20 million tons of peanuts are bought and sold, right? With the price floor, now buyers are facing a higher price. So if we move along that demand curve to the new price level, we're going to see that they will demand less. So quantity demanded falls to 10 million pounds. Whereas producers, they're excited about that price. If we trace up the supply curve to that new $1,000 price due to the price floor, we're going to see quantity supplied increase to 30 million tons. All right, so here we have a surplus. Quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. You can also call this excess supply. Right, so it's an excess supply or shortage. With this change in the price, sellers would like to sell 30 million tons, but buyers only want to buy 10 million. So only 10 million is bought and sold. So what we're going to see is this reduction of the amount sold, creating for us again deadweight loss, right? Deadweight loss is the foregone gains from trade because the trades do not happen. So consumer surplus goes from being ABC to just being A. Some of it is transferred to producers. And producer surplus goes from being DEF to being BDF instead. Okay, and then C and E are deadweight loss. All right, so these next few slides are going to walk through that. The price floor is set above the equilibrium price, so that means that it is binding. So because it's enforcing this higher price, quantity demanded is going to decrease from 20 million tons to 10 million tons. Quantity supplied will increase from 20 million tons to 30 million, which means that we have quantity supplied exceeding quantity demanded. So there is an excess supply or surplus in the market. We're no longer in equilibrium. As a result of that excess supply, people cannot buy or sell as many tons of peanuts as they'd like to, which means that there's going to be deadweight loss in our market equal to C plus E, right? There are some trades that aren't happening. People would like to buy more, but they can't, right? The higher price is not only going to produce some deadweight loss, but will also transfer some of that surplus from consumers to producers, right? So that area B goes from consumers to producers. And C and E are lost to deadweight loss. Okay. So because we have this transfer of surplus from consumers to producers, you're often going to see producer groups being the ones to lobby for price floors. This happens a lot in agriculture, where farmers lobby for their goods to be priced regulated so that they're priced above the market price in order to ensure that they get a greater return. All right, so let's go through some examples. We're going to start with some examples of price ceilings. So price ceilings are going to be things like rent control, price gouging laws, prohibition. We could call a price ceiling, so that's just a price set at $0. And one thing you need to keep in mind whenever we do this sort of analysis based on enforced price changes is that price changes are what instigate people to change their plans. So if prices don't change, we don't have, people don't have an incentive to change what they're planning to do. And so what we're going to see as a set of unintended consequences of price ceilings are people taking on non-monetary costs of purchasing a good or service, as well as non-price discrimination. So let's start with the market for toilet paper in 2020, right? If you remember in the US, everybody went crazy trying to get toilet paper. And as a result, many cities imposed pricing regulations, which amounted to price ceilings, right? They kept the price of toilet paper from rising, all right? So we have our initial price, and then we can draw in our price ceiling here with this purple line, and it's set below that equilibrium point, which means that it is binding, okay? So because we have this price change down, it's been forced to be lower. Sellers are going to reduce the amount that they want to sell. Quantity supplied of toilet paper is going to fall. And buyers are going to be increasing the quantity that they demand, right? Quantity demanded goes up because now toilet paper is cheaper than what it would be absent the price control, right? So what that creates is exactly what we experienced at that time in the US is a shortage of toilet paper. More people want to buy it than there is toilet paper available. And so what we see is people taking on some non-monetary costs of that price ceiling, right? They can't just go to any grocery store or, big supplier like Walmart or Target and get some toilet paper. Instead, they have to shop around, right? Maybe they go to different locations. Maybe they're standing in line for a long time to get in the store right as it opens so they can get some toilet paper, right? So they're taking on these forms of non-price discrimination and additional non-monetary costs, excuse me. If we were to draw in our surpluses here, so originally consumer surplus is this top triangle that I've drawn in, and producer surplus is this bottom shape. So that's where we would be if this market was in equilibrium at our initial P star knot. Okay? But because of the price ceiling, we're not there. So instead, we want to identify what those surpluses really are. So we're going to take the quantity supplied point on the supply curve at the price ceiling price and trace up to our demand curve, because that lower value, that quantity supplied, defines how much is traded, right? Buyers would like to buy more, but they can't because sellers are only willing to provide so much. Okay. So this is going to define for us our deadweight loss, right? The difference between what's actually bought under the price regulation and what would be bought under equilibrium. Okay. And then our consumer surplus is going to be that area above the price line and below the demand curve, and then formed by the amount traded and the price axis. So this whole trapezoidal shape. And we can see exactly what area of that is transferred from producers to consumers. Okay. Then our producer surplus is the area below that price line, above the supply curve, and otherwise bordered by the two axes. Okay, so we have producer surplus falling and consumer surplus getting that transfer from producers to consumers, and then both are losing some surplus in the form of deadweight loss. Let's look at another example. So rent control is another very popular type of price ceiling, especially in New York, right? For a long time, rent control was very common. So the goal of this policy is to ensure that people can afford their apartments. So that price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price. What that means is that consumers, people who want to rent, get really excited that quantity demanded goes up. A lot of folks are thinking, great, I don't have to live with roommates. I can afford these apartments, or they can move out of their parents' home, right? So they're increasing their quantity demanded that way. Suppliers, on the other hand, are reducing how much they're providing, right? They can't provide the same number of apartments at that lower price because that price is below their marginal cost of providing those spaces. So we have quantity supplied fall, quantity demanded increase, and that means that we're going to have a shortage or excess demand in this market for apartments. Okay, which is what people in New York have experienced for a long time. It's really hard to find apartments, and people are often renting with multiple roommates. Okay. So as a result of this shortage, fewer people are going to be able to purchase the type of apartments they want. Like I said, they maybe get a smaller space or they have to rent with roommates. And that's showing us that deadweight loss that we have in the market. There is some transfer from producers to consumers because now consumers get those apartments that they can purchase or rent at a lower price. and producer surplus is much reduced. Okay. In addition to the shortage, consumers are going to take on some non-monetary costs of being able to actually find an apartment. So they end up paying a much higher price for the apartments that they do get, but it's just that difference between the price ceiling price and the price that they quote unquote pay is non-monetary cost. So they're not actually paying dollars for it, they're paying in other ways. So one thing people would do for a long time is they would watch the obituaries, see who had died, and go try to rent the apartment they were living in. There was also a lot of queuing, right? People would have to take off multiple days to go apartment searching and find one that was available, and likely be on a long waiting list of folks who had inquired about that apartment, which obviously contributes to long searches. So they're having to wait a long time before they're able to secure an apartment. And likely they have to deal with discrimination, right? When apartment companies or landlords have many people wanting to rent the single apartment they're offering, that means they get to pick from all those folks because everybody's paying the same rent. And so they're likely going to pick people they like better. So that could be indulging in racist preferences, that could be indulging in sexist preferences, that could be engaging in discrimination against people of different sexualities, could be discriminating against people with pets, right? Maybe they don't want pets in their apartment. It could be discriminating against folks who aren't married but are living together. And so all of that's going to add to those non-price costs of folks when they're trying to find an apartment when rent controls are in place. Okay. In the long run, what we're going to see is landlords actually start to neglect their properties because at the rent control price, they are unwilling to upkeep the apartments in the same way. So initially with the rent control, in the short run, there's obviously a shortage that arises. But as landlords do not keep up the property, that supply curve becomes more elastic, right? They're willing to let it go into disarray because it's not worth it. They don't get enough to do the repairs from renting it. And we see that shortage get even worse as that quantity supply continues to fall. Okay, now let's move to some examples of price floors. So these are going to be things like minimum wage laws, price floors on agricultural goods, right? And again, we want to keep in mind that plans change only when prices change, right? Without a change in prices, people have no incentive to adjust their behavior. Okay. And so as a result of price floors, we're going to see a couple unintended consequences arise, just like we did in price ceilings. And these are going to be non-monetary costs and non-price discrimination. I've included, for those who would like it, a review about how prices provide incentives for consumers and producers. It's principles level explanation coming from Marginal Revolution University. It's this video that I've linked here. Price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. In this video, they break down, excuse me, the ideas that we're going to be reading in Hayek's 1945 article for this chapter. And so if you want to get a little bit of a review of those concepts before diving into Hayek, I recommend watching this video. But what it talks about is essentially when price controls are implemented, consumers and producers are going to receive conflicting information, right? So for producers, when we have a price floor, let's say implemented, they get this green light go, the price is up from that equilibrium price. And so they increase their quantity supplied. Whereas consumers get this stop message, right? As that price goes up, their quantity demanded is going to fall. And so with those conflicting signals, that's what is getting us the, oops, sorry, I clicked on the, sorry about that. I clicked on the link on accident. Okay. So the artificial change in price from the price floor gives conflicting signals such that we don't have a market clearing anymore. In the case of a price floor, we have a surplus, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. Right? In the case of a price ceiling, it's going to be the reverse. Consumers get the green light go. They increase the amount that they demand from equilibrium, whereas producers get the red light stop and they reduce quantity supplied. And so here, right, those conflicting signals again lead to markets not clearing. But in this case of the price ceiling, it results in a shortage. All right, so moving back to price floors, a major example of this is going to be tobacco, market for tobacco, that for a long time was regulated in the sense that there was a minimum price that could be paid. And so farmers were sort of guaranteed a level as a minimum amount of return on each bushel of tobacco they sold. Okay. What this price floor does is it raises the price above that equilibrium price, which, like we just mentioned, gives that green light to to producers. If we trace up that supply curve to the new price floor, we see that quantity supplied goes up from equilibrium. If we trace up the demand curve to our new price, we see that quantity demanded falls from equilibrium. And in this market, we get a surplus. The quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. So farmers want to sell more tobacco than consumers want to buy. And so this unintended consequence is this surplus, right? Farmers have all this tobacco they want to sell, but they can't because consumers don't want to buy it. And so they're now going to have to deal with some additional costs, some non-monetary costs. They have to figure out something to do with this tobacco. Maybe they have to incinerate it, get rid of it in some way. Maybe they have to figure out a way to store it for a long time so it retains its selling value. Maybe they have to offer deals. Maybe they have to seek out consumers. Maybe they have to expand their market advertising from local to national or international, right? And so they're having to take on all these additional costs just to find someone to buy their tobacco or do something, at least with the additional tobacco that they have that consumers don't want to buy. And they're not going to just produce less because they're only going to be responding to prices, right? They don't necessarily know why they're facing this surplus. All they know is that they are, right? So plans are only going to change when prices change. Without a change in price, we don't expect consumers or producers to change their behavior. Another example is the minimum wage, right? Similarly, when that price goes up, sellers are going to increase their quantity supplied. And remember who sellers are in the labor market, they're employees, right? So people who want to work are going to want to work more hours when the wage is higher. But consumers, right, employers don't want to hire people for as many hours when that price goes up. So we have a surplus of labor on the market, right? Which means that some folks, right, between our quantity supplied and equilibrium price are facing unemployment because they would like to work, but they can't find a job. And then some folks between our quantity at equilibrium and the quantity demanded at the price floor are facing disemployment. So they've actually lost hours because of the increase in the wage as a result of the minimum wage increase. So this goal is usually to ensure that people receive a higher livable wage, but the result is increased unemployment as well as some disemployment, meaning that more people are looking for a job than there are jobs available. People's hours get cut, and those folks that actually do receive full-time work at that higher wage are much fewer than the policy was intending to help. And we're going to see, of course, some non-price discrimination and non-price costs of suppliers, right? In this case, workers or employees having to take on in order to secure a job, right? Maybe they're having to search for a much longer time to find someone to hire them at that higher minimum wage. They might also deal with discrimination, right? If they don't look, sound, act the way that the potential employer wants them to, right? We're going to see them having a much harder time finding a job. And they might end up having to accept a lower quality environment, right? Maybe they get paid the higher minimum wage, but they work for a manager who harasses them all the time, right? But they are going to have a hard time leaving and finding another job because they would be entering a labor market with a ton of unemployed and disemployed people. And so those non-monetary costs are going to erode their gains from the higher minimum wage, right? Because it's only those number of labor hours that employers demand that will ultimately be hired. With that, we're going to stop our video, and the next we'll pick up looking at quotas.